Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that can trip us up in this interesting business of being humans is getting the lifestyle changes we need for sustainability. So I am now 48 and I'm noticing that they're just changes in results related to my same practices. So, for example, the same amount of calories seems to result in weight gain. There's a lot of science that backs that up. I'm not best pleased, but at the same time, subjectively, overall, my improved health and vitality have meant that the subjective experience of being in my body is actually better than it's ever been. I feel like I should be, knocking on wood in the US or touching wood in the UK or whatever other superstitions are helpful before I say this, but it's been a really long time since I've even had a head cold. There's a well-being that is lovely, and some of that is lifestyle practices, and a lot of it is mindset and keeping my fight or flight reaction calm. When it activates, I'm able to bring it down, so my body's spending a lot of time in thrive state. I prioritize sleep, and I work with the guides to ideally catch things that are spinning out, that are energy leaks in terms of my mental and emotional well-being at low levels. And obviously I talk a lot about all of these kind of things. But one of the things I kind of want to look at for all of us is being able to have a system to wrangle yourself into much needed life changes, because the cosmic joke of human biology is what gave us these incredible, sophisticated bodies and minds and systems was an environment that is really different than the modern world. And the modern world is benevolent. Our life expectancy vastly exceeds that of our cave person ancestors. We have so much opportunity. And at the same time, we have all of these legitimate biological cues and impulses with reward and punishment chemistry. So our brain is hardwired to give us happy, good feelings when we do things that are in favor of what would have been helpful for survival for hunter-gatherer people, and bad feeling chemistry when we do things that are not so helpful. And the modern world does a lot of yanking our chemistry hither and yon with a lot of highs and lows and ways that it gets distorted and moved around, and it makes it really complicated. Because if you really tune in, for example, when I was working as an engineer, I had that afternoon really big dip in energy, and it was difficult not to go to the vending machine and get a candy bar at that point. And that just was what I did at that time in my life. And at the same time, we know that maybe, sugar or caffeine or those kind of things as an afternoon offset to that kind of slump of fatigue is perhaps not optimal. And in fairness, for me, one of my biggest shadows or places of discomfort is feeling tired. I really resist a low level of energy, and so there tends to be a struggle to bring it up. It means that caffeine and sugar are way more my drug of choice than, say, alcohol, for example. But going back to that moment when I had perhaps decided earlier in the day that eating a Twix bar at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to finish out my engineering shift wasn't the strongest choice for myself, that maybe I wasn't going to do that. And in not doing that, there was literally tension in my body. My awareness kept getting pulled in this direction. And that wasn't kind of the psychological thing that we talk about, for sure. I didn't like feeling that way and such. But before we ever got to the more sophisticated emotional and psychological aspects that I think kind of sometimes get characterized as the root of lifestyle choices that aren't the most sustainable when persistent and compounded. Again, this isn't to encourage anyone to have, rigid control or absolute perfectionism, but just a collaborative, sustainable relationship with your body. And there may be a thing or two that is in the way of that. And so one of the things I just want to illuminate is that my body was creating tension because I was interrupting something that it felt was a very foolish survival choice. That available calories when I was feeling tired or stressed, and to not eat those seemed an absolutely absurd and life-threatening choice from the point of view of hunter-gatherer biology. If there's unclaimed food that of course is going to spoil and you have insecure access to food and nobody else in the tribe is going to be upset if you eat it, it's a really good idea to go back down to the break room and have one of those now stale donuts, even though you had one earlier and everybody's had all the donuts they want. And so I think it's just useful to notice that. There's a fellow who talks about the science of exercise and notices that there's aversion chemistry to burning calories that aren't related to survival. Hunter-gatherer people did not go for a morning jog, but they got enough movement related to survival to really sustain their body in a healthful way. But we're overcoming this rather strong biological impetus that tells us, don't go doing this foolish thing of wantonly burning calories with no survival advantage when there's insecure access to food, which is just around the part where the instincts haven't particularly updated themselves to the modern world, because the percentage of people having secure access to food on the planet is rather unprecedented. So I want to mention this first as we think about, how do we wrangle ourselves into a lifestyle change in a way that starts off acknowledging that it's a hard thing to do. People really, really struggle with this, and our biology is doing things to us that get in the way of that. And it doesn't mean that we can't override it, but it does mean that it's tricky. And I think a lot of narratives, when we start to look at shadow work, where we end up judging people harshly for, what we don't want to look at in ourselves in some way, shape, or form. So there are plenty of people who are like super fit who just aren't judgy of people who aren't. They're just like, oh, you're just having a different experience. And then there are, people who are sort of self-congratulatory in their lifestyle and somewhat contemptuous and judgy of people who aren't. And that has something to do with their relationship of where they maybe deny themselves flexibility, or they might be overly harsh with themselves, or they might be completely out of control in another area, like they're 3 years behind in their taxes, but gosh darn it, they go for a jog every morning. It's very usual that we are really good at the self-efficacy of doing the thing that's, not super fun, not super appealing. In one area, we have this great ability to wrangle ourselves, and then there's some other area that we, we might struggle. We might struggle to curb our online shopping or our, amount of time on Facebook. I'm on Facebook. I'm not against Facebook, but I do understand that Facebook is, developing ever more sophisticated algorithms to hack into my hunter-gatherer biology and make my brain think that scrolling and paying attention to Facebook is a good thing for survival. It's hitting that, the status parts of the brain, the connection parts of the brain, all of this reward chemistry. And it's just, I think, really useful to know how much advertising is tapping into that. Make people afraid, then sell them something. Sell them, from a point of view of a core longing that maybe they haven't addressed. So in navigating this, again, I just want to really emphasize starting with deep self-compassion if you haven't been able to cut down on the amount of wine that you're drinking, or get the exercise that you planned, or, get your taxes done in the timely manner that you intended, or wrangle yourself to go look for a job. We can, end up unemployed. And a lot of times, if it was a bad situation, we're pretty tired on the other side, and our instincts are going to say, save your calories. You're in stress state. Things are bad. And frankly, running the brain requires a ton of calories. And so part of this, crazy array of deterrent biology is our brain trying not to think harder than it can for survival because of how many calories go into running the brain. Like the shamanic work that I do and the journeys, they really take a lot of calories because so much of my brain lights up when I'm doing that work and journeying into an altered state and tracking things and moving energy. And, if I'm a little tired or depleted, even though I absolutely adore the work, I'll find myself not doing it. And you may find that about some kind of practice that is transformational to the patterning of the mind, that you're like, oh, I feel amazing when I do this. Why don't I do it? Why can't I get myself to do it? And so I'm not going to say that I have the absolute complete solution to implementing lifestyle changes that really create sustainability in health, but I can say that throughout my life, while I still have some lifestyle changes and adjustments that I'm still, kind of figuring out and working with, there are a lot more that are in place than aren't in place, and I've consistently implemented upgrades to my lifestyle along my path. So all of the energetic work that I've done and the emotional work I've done and the psychological work I've done have resulted in a capacity to effectively wrangle myself into something. And when it comes to lifestyle changes, there are kind of two categories. There's important and urgent lifestyle changes, and that's if your health is in some kind of an immediate downward spiral. If your taxes aren't done and you're going to face the wrath of the IRS. If the unpaid rent is moving toward, causing eviction, there are these things where there's a lot of pressure and intensity and urgency. And humans are actually a lot of times better at responding when the pressure is on. I had someone really point out to me that in terms of the early years of my business, I would get myself into, a little bit of a money pickle, a certain amount of money stress, not to the degree of not being able to pay my rent, but, credit card debts going up, I'm feeling stressed. And then I would get really creative and I would come up with new offers and possibilities and business pivots. And he was like, what if you went to the well of creativity? Katie, your well of creativity is huge. You're incredibly prolific. What if you went to that before the stress was on as a proactive step? And I really got it. And I'm like, oh, yes, let us do that. And it really smoothed out a lot of things in the way that I was approaching my business and made it much more effective and sustainable. So again, sometimes we have that urgent and critical, and something's going to break in my life that I'm not willing to have break if I don't, get on this. And in some ways, I think those lifestyle changes can be easier because it compels us to put our focus, and this is the urgent problem to solve. And a lot of times people are really, really effective at problem solving and getting really present with something, even if it's hard and complicated. And then there are the lifestyle changes that are in the category of, over time, this isn't going to be sustainable. One of my more stressful chapters in life, I was right at the end of my engineering job, and it was really time to step away from it because I'd spent years building up my practice, and I just really hit the point where I needed the full-time hours available to progress it any further. And I'd downsized the housing I was living in. I bought a little condo as opposed to the house I was sharing with my partner. We parted ways and I let him keep the house because I ran the numbers. And I'm like, well, if I don't have the house payment and I don't buy him out and I instead go the other direction, I'll be much more situated to step away from my engineering job. So I had everything in place, and there was just this, enormous fear. So I was fighting with, the security and the stability. And as a result, having been a very diligent, people-pleasing kind of employee for a lot of years, I was not doing a good job of the self-efficacy of making myself work on the thing I wasn't interested in when there was this other thing I was so passionate about. So there was tremendous psychological stress because I wasn't figuring out how to wrangle myself. And I knew that sooner or later they were bound to notice I wasn't working. In the reorganization, I'd moved away from having any particular accountability. They had reorganized badly, so I wasn't particularly being managed at the time. And I wasn't particularly in go-getter mood because my passion was elsewhere. And I added on to that stack of things a really unfortunate relationship, probably the most miserable romantic relationship I'd ever had with somebody who was just really a hateful person. And I mean that both in terms of being hateful to others, but also just such a deep well of self-hatred. And it was the misguided, oh, but I carry the archetype of the healer and I see your beauty and I can hold space for you. And that went about as well as you can imagine it would go. But this perfect storm of things where I was emotionally unregulated because of the relationship and tired, plus passionate about something that wasn't my work, I was not finding the self-efficacy to go to the organization and say, hey, you're underutilizing me. I need more work to do. I was just struggling to, show up. And I knew it was going to go in a bad direction over time, but I didn't know when. And sure enough, they ended up laying me off. It was very gracious that they didn't fire me. They changed my part-time position to a full-time position. But, I know if I'd chosen to go full-time instead of get laid off, we would have had some difficult conversations about what kind of employee I would need to be to keep my job. But, gracious exit, which was nice because I was really, really sensitive. I still am to some degree, but the failure in being the good girl, was something that I took emotionally hard at the time. But regardless, life moved forward. But for a lot of us, we're in varying degrees, like I know I'm going to lose my job if I keep on as I have, and tomorrow I swear I'll do better kind of place was an acute version of this. And it might be like, yeah, I know I'm going to have some blood sugar issues if I keep eating like this. And I know I might have some heart issues if I keep, this particular sedentary lifestyle. And, we can see the direction and we're talking to ourselves in the background, but it's in context of everything else that's going on in our lives. We've got all these other things going on. So what do you do? Like, this is a legit hard problem. Otherwise, humans would be humaning differently. We wouldn't have these incredible statistics of challenges that could be addressed effectively with lifestyle changes. And, not to single anyone out, but just looking kind of across the board at what the statistics tell us, there's a lot of stuff that we know would help our health that human beings by and large just don't do. And for you, looking at this, one of the things I want to offer is that moving the energy can be really helpful. So, for example, I have a fire ceremony that I think is really effective. You can find it on the articles page of my website under the resources tab, and there's a video. And, let's say you want to get going on looking for a job, or you want to lose weight, or you want to cut down on the sugar you're eating, or you want to drink less alcohol, or there's a drug addiction you're wrestling with. You can start moving the energy. The supplies are really, really cheap. Epsom salts and rubbing alcohol in a fireproof container. Really affordable, really attainable, really quick. And it's a fantastic way to go in and work with the guides and start moving energy along the destiny path that you want to move it along. There's putting in what you want to release and what you want to bring in to begin to create a form of self-hypnosis, to call in a team of guides, to create an energetic program. There's just a lot of stuff you're doing that moves the energy before you start with that sticky wicket of trying to make yourself take right action. So I think that's really powerful. I think also really getting to your deep why you want the change, because a lot of these lifestyle changes that we haven't figured out how to wrangle ourselves to implement, instead of going, Well, it's tricky. I haven't solved that problem yet. There's kind of this buildup of shame and self-accusation. It breaks self-trust when we decide, hey, I'm going to go work out tomorrow. And then we come up with a rationalization for why we don't. And some days it just is wise to skip a workout. Your body's like, yeah, that wouldn't be the right medicine for me. And other times, it's just these parts of us that say, hey, you're already having a hard time, don't go burn, a whole bunch of calories. And incidentally, I feel called to kind of throw in here, recent research is indicating that some of the really hard workouts that particularly Americans do are actually really counterindicated. Like it's worse for your health to go in the evening and do this super intense workout. If that's your jam, I don't want to, criticize, but the research is coming back with a lot more moderation as opposed to kind of extreme measures. We just, I think, have an attraction to big stories, dynamic energy. And so something that is just a really good, sustainable approach to lifestyle doesn't have a lot of like, wow, that's so impressive or wonderful. So it's good to recognize that when you're trying to wrangle yourself, that you're wrangling yourself the right amount, the increment where you've dialed in with the research what is truly most effective and supportive for what your goals are. Another piece of research I think is really useful is what's called tiny habits. It's a really good way to start, repatterning yourself, because somebody did a bunch of research just on the sort of psychological level of how do you get humans to make and sustain lifestyle choices. And it's a very simple kind of thing, and I think it's worth understanding. I am so passionate about understanding what my biology is telling me and what my brain is telling me and what my guides are telling me and what my addictive tendencies are telling me and what my old strategies for meeting needs are telling me, and all of these different things so that I can kind of lay them out and begin to work with them. Because if we have an acute, irrational fear of something, it is foolish to proceed forward on a course that would take us nose to nose with that irrational fear without accounting for how much of us can go covert in the meeting that need. There have been times when I was ambivalent about attending an event. There's this big camping event down in Mexico that was going to be completely removed from infrastructure. We were carpooling, it was going to, be in the experience, which, for me, one of the things I really like, I tend to drive myself to parties. So if I'm not having fun, I can exit. That's a really good kind of deal to make with myself about being social. And so this tension of wanting to go, but also being afraid and not reckoning with the fear and the anxiety and getting present with it meant that I was under the weather when it came time to go. And of course, it wouldn't have been a good choice at that point. So we can end up having a lack of sustainability if we try to use too much self-efficacy and force and dragging ourselves by the ear toward a certain pathway. And I would offer that one of the things that I think is really useful in this is thinking about working with a form of self-efficacy that is very moderate. So you have a craving for who knows what food, and you just make a deal with yourself, I'm just going to hang with this craving for 30 minutes. I'm going to take 30 minutes and I'm just going to hold on to the no, we're not going to do that. And then I will have made progress on my goal, even if I eat the thing. And I may not feel inclined to eat the thing after that, but we're just going to take a moderate amount of time to implement something else. And maybe it's I'm going to take 3 deep breaths before I, alleviate the tension in my body with the counterindicated for health, but my body doesn't know this action that my avoidance of is creating tension. Okay, I really desperately feel like I want the donut. Let me combine that with some protein and whole grains, because that'll make it easier for my body to process it. It'll be way, way, way better to to food combined with some sustainable nutrition along with the thing that I desperately want. And I feel like reckoning with ourselves isn't all that different than the endless negotiations that you can hear in a grocery store or with kids who are always trying to get the thing that will cause them the most pleasure in the moment. One more story, one more glass of water before bed, more syrup on my pancakes, more this. There's an element where kids are constantly wheeling and dealing to get ice cream or an extra treat or an extra biscuit or, 5 more minutes, and I think that internally we aren't so different as far as having a wheeling and dealing part. And the interesting challenge of the human mind is we can rationalize anything. If you do not want to go to the gym, your incredible supercomputer of a cognitive brain will begin mapping out all of the valid seeming reasons why not going to the gym is the absolute appropriate approach, and wheeling and dealing and bargaining. And we can use that to our advantage. We can use that to our advantage to say, okay, I'm really having a lot of resistance to the gym, but I'm going to keep the deal with myself to, go home and do 5 minutes of, strength exercises. And then if I don't completely hate it, I'll move on to something else. For me, the secret sauce to being at a time in my life where I reliably get all the exercise that is appropriate for me in terms of cardio, I fell in love with this program called Supernatural, where you're in virtual reality and you're beating at balloons and, just having this. And it's just been really sustainable. And part of it, I think, is my old love of ballroom dance, which I absolutely adored in college and haven't really found the structure to get back into it, but the responsive movement, the fact that I can pick the music, it's really helpful that I can have a temperature that's pleasing because the place I work out is in my bedroom. I don't have to do this big changing of clothes. I don't have to leave my lair. I think, especially if you're in a female body and you're not just someone who really craves stimulation, which a lot of energetically sensitive people get more than enough stimulation. There's an aversion, in cave people, it's hunter-gatherers. Leaving the cave posed a lot of dangers. You were a lot safer in the cave where you knew what was there and it had your back, so to speak. And, we needed to leave the cave to get food, but if we didn't, it was a little bit safer to hang in the cave, to do our work in the cave, so I don't have to leave the house so I don't have to overcome that, are you really sure you need to do this kind of chemistry? One of the things I want to offer, so compassion for yourself, just to review, compassion for yourself about how hard this really is, setting up the energy in motion. Fire ceremony is great. You can also, book a session with me and we can work on, messages from the guides about how to do this. If you know how to journey on your own, by all means, go and take counsel with the guides of what possibilities there are and invite new guides in to help you to make and implement the change. Moderation is important. It's, generally a lot to overhaul your lifestyle all at once. Now, if you're on that urgent, this is one of the most important projects in my life, sure, you can pour an enormous amount of energy in. But generally, the most sustainable wisdom is that, much like a child, if you watch children do air travel, by the end of the day, they're very, very likely to be having a meltdown in baggage claim. And they've just had to behave and been in unfamiliar environments and had to sit in seats and stay still. There's just so many demands on them conforming to a standard of behavior that wouldn't have been true if they were, at preschool or at home. All the routines and standards are disrupted, and as a result, great howls of misery when they have to stand there and wait for the bags are, not an uncommon thing. So I think how obstreperous your child is feeling is useful. And sometimes it's completely valid to substitute, to be like, wow, I am really dug in about not exercising, but I'm open to going and eating a plate full of veggies and drinking some water, and that would move the dial so that ability to bargain in a sustainable way with yourself, I think is good. The building of the muscle of self-efficacy is really helpful. And then this other thing that I want to recommend is getting your inner engineer into the mix. And what I mean by that is research and development. So with lifestyle changes, the cool thing is we have an absolutely endless menu of so many ways to wrangle ourselves into a sustainable, healthy lifestyle, because others have gone before, many others through many different pathways, and a lot of them have written books or created YouTube channels or created articles. There's programs, there's just so much out there of people who have found a pathway to a life change that was sustainable and available to them when a bunch of other stuff had failed. I've tried so many things to dial in the consistent exercise thing. I've gone hiking in the hills. I've gone to the gym. I've done many things. And happily, this interesting virtual reality program is a real secret sauce where I exercise regularly and consistently and work out till I'm dripping sweat without fighting with myself, with mild aversion chemistry, or, I'm available for that. And sometimes I pretend I'm going to work out for half the time that I actually do. And then once I'm into it and the chemistry's flowing, I don't have the same aversion. The completion and checking a box and the chemistry rewards for that are more interesting to my system than the aversion to movement. Once we're in motion, it can be, a lot easier. But it took a lot of different tries. And so getting your inner problem solver or inner engineer into this brainstorming chemistry of, saying, hey, let me come up with some ideas to try. I can sit down and brainstorm and come up with a list. I can Google and people will come up with a list. How do I calm my anxiety? Having our fight or flight activated just hammers away on our health and well-being and patterns our brain differently. It does all this crazy stuff. So there are lots and lots of people who are, how to interrupt the fight or flight hammering away. A man named Dr. Chatterjee wrote a book called The Stress Solution that gathers just an enormous amount of possibilities. And it's great to grab the low-hanging fruit of the things that are easiest to implement and you have the least resistance to. So there's this endless array of possibilities, but the important thing with this is to iterate on the research and development cycle. Incidentally, if you have a lot of emotion about a lifestyle change that you have the story you should have implemented and you haven't, putting that shame and self-judgment into the fire ceremony is a really great thing to do, because we really want to go at this with curiosity, like, it's a complicated thing to wrangle a human being to do something that will ultimately give them way more quality of life that they long for and yearn for, but our biology thinks it's a life-threatening kind of thing and is trying to prevent us from making those moves with the best, most up-to-date information it has, which is all pre-Dark Ages. So what do I do to wrangle myself, given that I physically have the biology and I have, this need and desire to make this change? And how do I do it in the most elegant way? Because, some of the really intense approaches people take where they're like, I'm going to do a boot camp and I'm going to, really force myself to do the thing. And that's fine. Some people love that. They thrive on it. But the challenge is that if you put all of your attention onto something, then inevitably life happens. You have a parent who has an illness. You have a child who's going through a crisis. You have a change in employment. Like they're just these things that happen. And when you get caught up in needing to have something else be a top priority, something that just takes enormous amounts of energy and attention, isn't particularly sustainable. So I'm super interested in sustainability, and it just turns in the background and it does what it needs to do to get you enough health and enough well-being. I am a huge fan of this concept of enough, because so many messages are like ever upward, and enough is really powerful. I have a whole podcast on that you can go listen to. But this iteration where you brainstorm, which your brain is going to resist doing because it takes a lot of calories to come up with new solutions, and then you might spend still more calories implementing them. And remember, our bodies don't know we have secure access to food. Even if we're carrying a lot more weight than we would prefer, they still don't realize we have secure access to food. So there's some self-efficacy. Pick a moment when you're feeling, better, more in flow, and if you're really resistant, make it a short kind of round. I'm going to Google for 5 minutes. I always keep shortening the time until I find something I'm not resistant to. And then once I'm in the activity, a lot of times, there's like, oh, this isn't so bad. So you might end up, researching for 20 minutes and brainstorming and remembering that it's actually really fun and interesting to solve problems. But in this process of new possibilities, and if you're at a loss, then there are lots of smart people who could advise you. I'm one of them. Do a session with me. I'll talk to your guides. I'll get you lots of possibilities. Or you may have a qualified friend. Hey, what's worked for you? Hey, what's worked for you? You can take a poll, but whether you're using your own inspiration, the internet inspiration, experts who've gone before, your social circle, people love to solve problems. You post on Facebook, hey, what works for people around this? And people get very excited to comment on that post. There's just a lot of love of coming up with solutions, especially if we don't have to be the ones to implement them. So infinite possibilities. And the trick is to sort of gather them and capture them, decide on an experiment to run. I'm going to experiment with this thing. When I signed up for the virtual reality exercise app, someone had told me about it. I had no idea if it was going to work. It was worth for me, given how important the problem was, to get enough exercise, and given how much I'd struggled with it, to invest in the Oculus headset this might work. I don't know if it'll work, but it's sure worth trying out. So I got that, and I got the program, and it's been terrific. But you're picking an experiment to run that seems like it would be most likely to work. And the trick is to then have the feedback loop, to schedule a time with yourself to come back and review your results. Okay, I plan to, start with this approach. This is my results. It worked great. Fantastic. You're on track. What do you want to add into the experiment? How do you want to adjust and tweak it? Or, well, I sure didn't do that. I made a plan and I didn't implement it. Silly human. And again, this is the gentleness, because if you feel like it's going to be a moment to call yourself on the carpet and beat yourself up for not implementing the plan, it's just saying, well, that wasn't the right plan for me. What is the new plan? What is the new possibility? How do I do this new research and development? And you can go for a walk in nature and kind of be with that question. And that's a really great way to access your wisdom and your intuition and the suggestions of your guides. If you're asking a question, there are ways that the universe will bring answers to you. Or maybe you have a meditation or a shamanic journey practice. Maybe you're putting into fire ceremony. I'll find a really great solution to getting enough exercise, or, cutting down on sugar, or cutting down on wine, or whatever it is that it genuinely would serve you to make a shift in. And so in working with this, there's no way we're not going to have some self-efficacy where we sit with attention and we break pattern. Like there's always going to be tension and struggle, and a part of us trying to rationalize our way out of it. What I would argue is it's a good muscle to build, so that, just like, you watch parents, and there are times when kids get what they want because the parent is just too worn down to keep fighting the good fight. And they know that this is going to make for so many more, fights, and arguments and such later, because it worked that one time, and humans are so good at random reinforcement. So, you're like, my mom tells a story of, she was very adamant about not giving her children sugar. And, there was one day she was exhausted. She gave us ice cream, and she said she'd always been kind of self-righteous. I don't know why people would give their children these things that are so bad for them. And she gave us ice cream, and there was silence. We were just eating the ice cream. We weren't squabbling with our sibling. And she's like, I now understand why people give their children these things that aren't good for them because of, that momentary relief at a moment where I was a very strong-willed child. I was a little indigo, and the first system indigo kids bust is the family system. So, she got a very, very willful child in me, and my sister is no less of a determined being in her ways. And so having that compassion, having that awareness, but finding ways to say, where is it just a little bit more self-efficacy? What could I do? And I think having a written list is really useful because it might be really unattainable to come up with a self-efficacy to make yourself go to the gym. But you might be able to do fire ceremony to say, I release my resistance to the gym. And again, I'm just using gym as an example. It doesn't mean that that's your correct path or the most optimal solution. It certainly wasn't for me. But whatever it is that you've decided to implement, and then you have a scheduled time with yourself that you put in a structured reminder because you're liable to forget. I think this is an important thing to come back and review your results. And with research and development, the great thing is, if the thing catches fire, that's such good information to have before you release the product and your company has huge liability. You find out what doesn't work, and that hones the solution of what does work. It's a really fun job from the point of view of budding engineers to be in research and development, where you get to play with new opportunities and possibilities and getting to make things that haven't been before. And most of them don't work, but that journey of creativity and exploration, there's a really wonderful book called Big Magic, and it's about the importance of living a creative life and the creativity in our mind and brainstorming mode and reviewing our results from this curiosity of, wow, it's a complicated problem to wrangle myself to do something that my biology thinks is life-threatening, but science and, other people's experience and everything I know about the world intellectually tells me would be really supportive. And there's even research and development in that. One of the things I sort of long for when I get overwhelmed by all the different nutrition information is somebody to just figure out like what was right and stick it in front of me, because you just, pretty much across the board, like highly processed food, artificial sweeteners, too much sugar, there's general agreement that, a bag of Doritos not doing you any favors in terms of your overall health. But then within that, there are just so many different philosophies that if you tried to do a Venn diagram of everything from all these leading nutritionalists that I thought was healthy, you just wouldn't be left with a sustainable amount of food in the intersection of all these circles. You drink a lot of water, but there's just so much difference of opinion. It can get really overwhelming. So you might be absolutely convinced that something would be really helpful for you and find that actually your body didn't do so well with it, but your body does really well with that. So as kind of a final thought, a lot of times we take on information from experts, and I love experts. I think experts are wonderful. But there's also the research and development of trying things and finding what your secret sauce is, because I know how full all of our lives are, and being really efficient about tending your health in a sustainable way is also incredibly useful. So the more, I have these core practices, and that pretty much gets me to enough health and sustainability, I think is incredibly worthwhile. And sometimes people implement things that are really counterindicated for who they are in their particular body. And so when you're evaluating your results, I think it's really useful, to understand basic things like, if I cut out some processed food, I may have a detox, so I may not feel super great. If I cut down on coffee, I may have, some backlash while my system resets. So it doesn't mean that like every second feels amazing. But overall, once you've kind of gone through those, struggles of the body to adapt to a new upgraded approach, you really do want that feedback. So I know there's a lot here. I think it's kind of a lifelong journey that we work with, but I want to encourage you to call in the support of your guides, call in the support of your intuition, use your focus and intention to align the energy so you have that extra wave of momentum behind you when you start reckoning with the instinctive aversion and resistance and literal tension in the body when you try to make a healthier choice. I think that's important. I think having ways to clear out the shame, I think I've shared this before on the podcast, but I realized at one point I'd gotten there early for an appointment, had time to go for a walk, went for a walk, and just being engaged in moving my body, my mind was reviewing how far short I was falling on exercise for what I had the story I should be doing. And I just had this moment of insight, like, of course I don't want to go for a walk. It becomes this like my mind isn't distracted, and so I'm criticizing myself the whole time. Why would I want to do this, this thing, even though, it was above the ocean and a beautiful day and a lovely temperature, like so much could have been exquisite about the experience, but it turned into this other thing because I hadn't reckoned with my own emotional landscape. So I was thrust into it by trying to make the lifestyle change. So if you can clean that up before you try to make the lifestyle change, so you aren't reckoning with the two at the same time, that's really helpful. So anyway, I know I've covered a lot of ground here, and I just really hope that there's something that is effective and is supportive, because we don't want to be in an adversarial relationship with our biology and our instincts, but we do want to be able to provide them with enough adult supervision that we're on a destiny path, ideally, of longevity, if that's something that's available to us. And again, I know there are plenty of health conditions that aren't lifestyle based, but science says, the majority of them really do have a component. And so being able to wrangle yourself, and again, I'm focusing on lifestyle because that's a place where I've had the most struggle. I am a good doer of taxes, but all of this applies if you're, struggling to take right action in terms of balancing your checkbook or going to the grocery store in a timely manner, or whatever it might be. This research and development and trying things so that you have a sustainable way of working with this really important aspect of life. You can get yourself to do things you need to do without too much struggle that have big ramifications down the line on your overall outcomes. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.